Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. So thank you all for coming. My name is Steve Lewis. I'm a director of the China Studies program here at the Baker Institute. Very happy to introduce an old friend of the China Studies program, Dr. Aynne Kokas. Let me tell you just a little bit about her, just so you can get all the background, since we don't do printed programs anymore. Aynne Kokas is the C.K. Yen Professor at the Miller Center at University of Virginia and an Associate Professor of Media Studies, also at UVA. Her research examines Sino-US media and technology relations. Her award-winning first book, Hollywood Made in China, University of California Press, 2017, argues that Chinese investment and regulations have transformed the US commercial media industry, most prominently in the case of media conglomerates, leverage of global commercial brands, which is very much tying into the topic she's going to be talking about this evening. Dr. Kokas is a non-resident scholar here at Rice University's Baker Institute's China Studies program. She's a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations, a fellow in the National Committee on United States-China Relations Public Intellectuals program, and then she's received a lot of fellowships. From the Library of Congress, National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, Japan's Abe Fellowship. She brought me back some Kit Kats from Tokyo, and other international organizations. For somebody, at the earlier stages of her career, this is just amazing. Her writing and commentary have appeared globally in more than 50 countries and 15 languages. I believe this book, you were saying, possibly will be coming out in Japanese as well? It is definitely coming out in Japanese as well. In the United States, her research and writing appear regularly in media outlets, including CNBC, NPR's Marketplace, The Washington Post, and Wired. Literally, whenever I get a notice from our marketing people here at the Baker Institute, I'm like, oh, that's what Anne's doing this week, because she's always doing something on media. She's very good at making her research publicly accessible. She has also testified before the Senate Finance Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the U.S. International Trade Commission. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Dr. Aynne Kokas. And I just wanted to say she'll talk for around 40, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have question and answer, and then hopefully by 7 we'll move outside for further conversations, but also she'll be able to sign a copy of her book. And I believe Brazos Books has made copies of those available. So I can just say you will really enjoy reading the book. I'm a China scholar, and I've known Anne for many years, but I'm reading it going, okay, I did not know this. Again and again and again. This is a very informative, very helpful book. So, Dr. Aynne Kokas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. It's a true honor to be back here at Rice. This book actually had its inception here at Rice with the support of Dr. Steve Lewis and Dr. Chris Bronk, who's also here in the audience, and Dr. Dan Wallach, who's also in the cybersecurity lab here at Rice. It helped me to open and expand and think about my work from a policy standpoint, and I'm forever grateful for this community for helping to foster this work. So I'd also like to thank Ambassador David Satterfield for his leadership of the Baker Institute, to Steve Lewis for his leadership of the China Center, and to the Chao Center for Asian Studies, which brought me on here as a postdoctoral fellow a while ago, actually. We don't have to go into all the dates, but it's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. So this book actually emerged from my first book, Hollywood Made in China, and I happened to be doing a Fulbright scholarship in 2009 in China, trying to work on my dissertation very diligently, and my internet kept cutting out. And so it was very annoying, very frustrating to be trying to finish your dissertation. And it turns out that my neighbors across the street at that point were actually running a virtual private network or proxy server company. And so they allowed me to work in their offices. And so because of that, I had this reliable internet connection, but also I was working through this issue in my head about why certain companies weren't able to enter the Chinese entertainment market. So why Disney was able to enter the Chinese entertainment market, but Netflix couldn't. And I was, kind of trying to decide if I would include Netflix in my first book. And my colleagues at the VPN company were like, you know what, it's not about the content of Netflix, it's about their data and what the data that they're able to gather in China. And so that put me on an entirely different pathway to think about my next book project, which brought me to Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. And then I was able to work on that research and develop it here at Rice. And then over a period of years, now I'm at the University of Virginia, and it's really a pleasure to be back here. So the argument of the book is basically that while there's a lot of discussion right now, and especially here in Texas, about the data that the Chinese government is gathering about users through apps like TikTok, one of the things that I argue in the book is that this is actually more of an opportunistic practice. So what we see is a U.S. data environment that has very fragmented regulations about what types of user data can be gathered about individuals. And this is fragmented on a lot of levels in terms of who has oversight. So a lot of you may have seen these Texas government bans. We've got state government bans. We have local government responses. We have federal government responses. There's also the time horizon issue in terms of data oversight in the US. So looking at 2-year congressional terms, 6-year Senate terms, 4-year presidential terms, lifetime court appointments, and a whole range of other types of time horizon issues that don't really exist in a Chinese context. And in China, data security oversight is occurring on the level of, Xi Jinping's lifetime appointment to his role. So in a technology world where these kind of iterative and these long-term visions really matter, when we're thinking about setting up a whole new way of operating in the global system, this kind of long-term time horizon makes a huge difference. And that's why when we see Chinese firms gathering data in the US and then being pressured to share that data in the Chinese context, this is part of a larger vision from the Chinese government to expand cyber sovereignty, or this idea of a digital sovereign nation. But the big challenge here is not that China is doing something so unique, but really that the US is completely stepping back from building that kind of global vision for itself. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the US has benefited financially from not really having a very robust national data oversight system, because companies like Facebook and Google or companies like Meta and Google and Amazon are able to grow and build shareholder value by extracting large amounts of user data. And so it's a strength of the US system, and it's been a financial strength of the US system to have this very fragmented and often relatively permissive system to gather user data. But now within a US-China context, the Chinese government is kind of expanding its oversight. And so we're in a very difficult moment for policymakers who, in many ways, have benefited from and grown from the really expansive power of the US tech sector, but now are faced with regulating global tech companies that have close ties with the Chinese government. And so it's not an easy landscape, and I'll try to lay it out for you here. But before we begin, one thing that I really think is important to note is that right now, in this particular moment in the US context, what we see is a lot of discussions about the China threat, and China as a significant concern for US policymakers. We have a new congressional committee on China, for example. Now, one of the challenges here is that if we don't look at specific targeted concerns and instead just talk about China broadly, that actually prevents careful policymaking from happening. Because in truth, the US and Chinese trade systems and economic systems are deeply entwined, and to actually try to completely decouple would be economically disastrous for both countries. That being said, there are significant areas of concern, such as Chinese government pressure by two Chinese firms to share user data through things like national security data audits. So as scholars and as concerned citizens, and as people interested in this area, what's really important is to look at these kind of narrow targeted areas of concern and try to address US public policy goals to meet those specific concerns. Because just trying to, for example, broadly decouple from the Chinese economy doesn't really present a lot of economic benefits, or even really target the concerns that we need to really address. So at the core of my book is this concept called data trafficking. And what we're talking about here is the legal movement of data between countries for national security purposes. And so a good example here is thinking about an app like TikTok, where TikTok is able to gather extensive user data in the US. People sign up for it. I teach a class called The Data Ethics of TikTok at UVA, where we read the TikTok terms of service. My students go into depth about all the TikTok terms of service. They identify all the problematic areas, and then I ask them if they're going to still keep the app on their phone, and they're like, well, I want to have friends. So we're in this environment where people are signing away their user data because of the larger network effects, or because of the larger impacts of being on those platforms. And then countries like China can have really robust data oversight frameworks that allow them to pressure firms to share their user data. And I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of the TikTok case and in the Q&A, because it's an area of some interest. But TikTok is only one small example of where this occurs. And in my book, I talk about a wide range of different areas, including things like household devices, health data, gaming data, payments, baby monitors, security cameras, you name it. And so when we think about these issues, it's important to move beyond just questions of social media and think about the broader data ecosystem that exists within the US and where Chinese firms are participating. When we think about data and the data part of data trafficking, we want to think about this idea of data as a resource. So, here we are in Texas thinking about it as the new oil, something that we want to extract and monetize. But also as the foundation of underlying systems and underlying infrastructure. So before the talk, we were just having a great chat about ChatGPT, and ChatGPT, this AI platform that has gathered large amounts of text and can answer questions for you based upon the text that's gathered. But that text that is being generated by ChatGPT is also based upon the text that's available online. So the richer the data that users are able to gather, the richer the data that platforms and apps are able to gather, the more targeted and more sophisticated those systems become. So when we're thinking about something like TikTok, getting back to that example, it's not necessarily just about what's being gathered about an individual user. It's about how that system is generating profiles and knowledge about the world. And that's why user data becomes so important. And actually, in the case of TikTok, we have this new potential data storage system that's actually it's going to be supposedly located here in Texas. But the Chinese government is preventing export of the TikTok algorithm from China for national security purposes. So there's this really interesting moment where we think about data as a way to understand individuals, but also as a way to build infrastructure for new AI tools and beyond. We can also think about data as an asset. So one thing that a lot of times people don't think about is that the data that they share with companies, so for example, if a company goes into bankruptcy protection, there's actually the possibility that data can then be sold or shared as part of that company's efforts to mitigate its debts. But the thing that is at the core of my thinking in this idea of data trafficking is thinking about data as a personal or intimate feature of our lives. And I think this is at the core of when we think about how user data is generated and what it means to us. And this is one of the reasons why the TikTok case is so resonant with a lot of people. It's because we're not just talking about a product or something that can be, extracted from the ground. We're talking about our lives and our personalities and our communities being turned into products that can then be extracted and exported. So when we think about the word trafficking, I use a couple of different frameworks to think about this idea as well. So we can think about drug trafficking, this kind of mobile, multi-layered system of trade that produces financial benefits and also is so beneficial that there are a lot of stakeholders that really don't want to pull back from it. And it's also an addictive substance. So once you get into this system, it's very difficult to pull back. And it's not a coincidence that we think about apps and we think about app users as well. So they're kind of related in this area. When we think about human trafficking, we think about the exploitation of our humanity, of our most intimate thoughts and experiences, our bodies. So one of the features of apps that are able to gather information about individual user experiences, and one of the cases I talk about in my book is the LGBTQ dating site Grindr, which shares bodily images of people, and that those also are fed into algorithms to generate synthetic media or deep fakes, as they're often called. And then finally, data traffic, or the movement of data on platforms and on different apps. And this is part of what makes something such a rich product. So the more traffic that we see on a platform, the more traffic that we see on an app, the more traffic that a company is able to generate, the more it's able to attract advertisers, the more it's able to attract users. So data traffic is also at the core of data trafficking. Now, all of this also relies on network effects, or the idea that the more people use something, the more people use something. So when I was talking about my students who don't want to get off TikTok, even though they have a full understanding of and are kind of appalled by the potential risks that they face to their own personal data, and the kind of collective larger risks, they want to be a part of the app because it's something that is necessary for their social lives. Now, in the book, I talk about other more expansive networks, so things like Syngenta, which is a subsidiary of the Chinese state-owned enterprise ChemChina, which undergirds a lot of the U.S. precision agriculture ecosystem. So data-driven agriculture. The more farmers that use Syngenta products, in this case a product called AgriEdge Excelsior, the more farmers want to use it because then they can integrate with their communities, integrate with other industries. So, for example, the Ram truck now has AgriEdge Excelsior, and if you have a Ram truck, then you can use that to better manage your precision agriculture tools on your farm. So the network effects we can see them in a social media context, but they apply across a wide range of other different areas. And when we think about the US tech ecosystem, this is where this all becomes really interesting, because tech companies have grown and become wealthy and been able to generate huge amounts of shareholder value because of the network effects that they've been able to generate, as well as a rather limited oversight framework, which allows extensive user data extraction. Now, one of the things that I think often doesn't get addressed in a lot of these debates about the US-China tech competition is that actually users in China have more official legal protection from corporate data exploitation than users in the United States do. Now, this is not to say government data oversight. Okay, that's important. We're not talking about like extensive user protection everywhere, but these national security data audits, where the government actually is able to oversee the type of data that companies are gathering, does actually limit the type of user data that corporations can gather about individual users. And this is because the power dynamic is very different in a Chinese tech context than in a US tech context, where the Chinese government is trying to maintain a larger control over user data than in the US, where we see the tech sector having more control. So I think this is an important type of context to have a full understanding of, because that often gets lost in a lot of the debates in the US. Now, we have these fragmented data regulations, as I mentioned earlier, fragmented over time, fragmented over branches of government. We have fragmentation between the private sector and the public sector. So, a lot of data, a lot of self-governance by the tech sector. And this is interesting. So a lot of those frameworks drew upon self-governing frameworks for the energy industry as well. So there's an interesting dynamic there in terms of building on pre-existing regulatory frameworks that we see in other sectors in the US. So we see something called surveillance capitalism, which is a term introduced by the scholar Shoshana Zuboff, where we basically run data collection on the human experience. Now, what this ultimately creates is a landscape where in the US we see data problems emerging very much like we see climate change problems, where individuals become responsible for making decisions that affect the collective. So when we think about, for example, turning on, one of the questions I often get when I'm talking about this is, how should I adjust my privacy settings? And what do I need to do to not be surveilled? And unfortunately, this is a question that is really unfair to the asker, because really, users should be, it shouldn't be the job of an individual user to go in and be able to adjust their privacy settings, to find the perfect outcome. Just like if an individual user just reduces their carbon footprint, it doesn't necessarily solve climate change. These are collective concerns. But one of the things that's really interesting here is that when we see, this is very similar to a lot of other types of US government oversight issues, where there's a devolution to individual users and their responsibilities, but actually data gathering, in this case, has a kind of widespread impact on larger community issues. And so just because you change your privacy settings doesn't mean that your friend hasn't left theirs open and they can, data about you can be gathered, or it doesn't mean that there can't be larger community modeling that occurs on the app more broadly. Now, what we see is that this is also occurring in an environment where China has expanded its cyber sovereignty oversight. So there are a wide range of different Chinese policies that become really prominent here. So we see direct oversight, for example, from something called the Cybersecurity Law, which was implemented in 2017 and requires all data generated in China by foreign and Chinese companies to be stored on Chinese government servers. Now here, there's an interesting comparison to be made between the Chinese system and the US system. So when we're talking about something like TikTok and data storage on Oracle servers through something called Project Texas, the Texas state government is not in charge of that data. In a Chinese context, it would be as if the Texas state government was in charge of user data. So there's a big difference in terms of how user data is actually stored and who is in charge of it. So this is a key distinction. And this isn't just applying to Chinese firms. This is also applying to foreign firms, to US firms that are operating in China. So for example, Apple's iCloud data is all stored on Chinese government-run servers in China. And there's a chapter in my book called "What Happens in Vegas Stays in China," and I like to do the little pitch here, but the point of that, like the kind of intro moment of that book, is that Apple in 2019 had this consumer electronics show Billboard where they had just not shared user data with the FBI following the San Bernardino shootings. And so they were very proudly pronouncing the data privacy that the firm had. Meanwhile, 2 years earlier, they had moved all of their iCloud data onto literal Chinese government servers in China. Right, it's kind of breathtaking when you think about it. And so we see the power of the Chinese government in asserting these claims, but often it's in the absence of any kind of U.S. government oversight. So Apple wasn't doing anything illegal. They weren't violating any national laws, even though they were sending huge amounts of user data into Chinese government-run servers. It was just how they were operating. It was a cost of doing business in China, essentially. Now, what we see also, so the data security law has what I was discussing earlier, these national security data audits where the Chinese government can oversee data gathered by Chinese firms domestically and globally. So this is one of the big concerns about, for example, the TikTok case, this national security data audit pressure, and what the precise relationship is between TikTok and ByteDance, its Chinese parent company. And this is a bit murky. And then finally, things like the provisions for online internet governance. And I think we have some students in here, and maybe you went to school online for a little while. And if you did, apologies. I had to teach online too. It wasn't that awesome. But one thing that's really interesting about the provisions for online internet governance is it makes users, as well as producers, as well as platforms. So if we think about Zoom as a platform, if we think about people who share material on Zoom as producers, and we think about people who speak on Zoom as users, it makes those people criminally and civilly liable for any way in which they violate China's national security online. So for example, at UVA, we had students who were taking classes on controversial subjects in China, and they were participating in those classes on Zoom. And like after 2019. So this created civil and criminal legal risk. And I mean, to my knowledge, no one has been prosecuted under those provisions, but they exist and they present, long-term legal jeopardy for different individuals. So it's a challenging moment right now, and because of China's expansive vision for what constitutes cyber sovereignty, and the lack of a kind of vision in the U.S. context, the lack of a kind of affirmative vision rather than just general fragmentation, we're seeing a moment where China is expanding its digital oversight. So, and these are just kind of the high points. I'm happy to talk about other other regulations that have emerged. These are the ones that I think are the most eye-opening. So what we see is that China has really expanded its claims to cyber sovereignty, and this is actually in line with a lot of Chinese government efforts to expand claims into areas of contested sovereignty. So when we're talking about areas of contested sovereignty, we can think about things like space or the Arctic, or the Chinese government would argue the South China Sea, and the digital landscape is another area where it's less about actual conflict between official areas where sovereignty is clearly recognized, and more about finding gray areas in the international order and kind of exploiting those. And this is what my colleague at Stanford, Oriana Schuyler Mastro, calls being a stealth superpower. So it's a way to expand oversight into areas where there isn't necessarily a clear international consensus. And to be perfectly frank, there isn't even an international consensus on what constitutes digital sovereignty between developed democracies that are longtime allies. So for example, the general data protection regulations in the European Union weren't necessarily first written with China in mind. They were written because of concerns about US corporations gathering user data in Europe. I was a fellow this past summer at Waseda University in Japan and had the chance to talk with a lot of Japanese officials, and they noted that they're in a difficult position because they're neighbors with China and have continuous trade ties, and the US, for example, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now called CPTPP, and China is eager to join. So when we're thinking about these issues of China's claims on cyber sovereignty, it also has to do a lot with the shifting global relationships in areas like digital sovereignty between developed democracies. And this is an area of really significant challenge that we're facing right now in terms of interacting with our partners and allies in the European Union, in Australia, in Korea, in India, in Japan, in Korea. And there isn't necessarily consensus between those countries either, but for example, the European Union and Japan at least have data adequacy agreements, so data transfer agreements that are based on common standards of digital privacy. So it's an interesting moment that we're in right now, one of a lot of dynamism. We also see a lot of regulatory asymmetry between China and the United States, which further complicates this issue. And so I was at the Lunar New Year celebration at the Chinese embassy on Tuesday, and I was talking with one of the political counselors about the challenge of, or about the data sovereignty issue as it relates to TikTok. And and his argument was that, users should feel comfortable with Project Texas and Oracle storage of TikTok data. But when I brought up this idea of TikTok's algorithm not being exportable because of national security concerns, and how the Chinese government might respond to a similar algorithm not being exportable, but those companies operating in China, his tone changed a little bit, because these are concerns that aren't necessarily resolved because there is a lack of reciprocity there. And this is a really significant concern when we're looking at international trade issues. So, for example, a company like Tencent has massive investments across a wide range of sectors in the United States. And in one of my chapters, I talk about Tencent's investments in the gaming industry and online games in the U.S. And it's a major investor, for example, in Fortnite and a wide range of other different. We were talking earlier today about Genshin Impact, another popular game. So this becomes really interesting when we're looking at this lack of reciprocity in terms of user data gathering. And Tencent is an interesting case because it's not only a gaming company, but it's also at the core of what China calls its military AI intelligentization efforts. So gathering dual-use technologies, developing dual-use technologies that are not just used in a commercial standpoint, but also in terms of AI applications for the military use. But this is a tough moment for the tech sector, as there still remains pressure to expand into the Chinese market, and we see companies like Tesla finding China to be their only profitable current market. We also see a moment where it's very difficult to oversee these issues in the U.S. government. There's limited appetite, or there's some appetite, but limited capacity to even address issues with U.S. tech companies. Through the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission and in Congress. So it's difficult to address these concerns, and it's becoming even more difficult as companies like TikTok become more TikTok and WeChat and Syngenta become more integral to U.S. industrial ecosystems. And at this point, 30% or 25% of people under 30 get their news from TikTok, and that number is only increasing. So when we're thinking about these issues, it's an issue of things. I know I'm seeing like there's not a lot of it's hey this it's I mean also it's where people under 30 do their searching as well, which is interesting. So when we're thinking about the ability to actually push information, it becomes really significant, particularly in the event of more tensions between China and the United States. But I mean, I think one key point here is that trade with China isn't just an issue of what's happening in China. It also amplifies the illiberalism and the lack of transparency that already exists within the U.S. tech sector. So companies like TikTok or companies like Syngenta are just taking advantage of a system which has few guardrails. And that lack of guardrails has advantaged the U.S. system and its growth, not just domestically in the U.S., but globally. And now we're in a moment where it's difficult to navigate between that profit motive and also the potential geopolitical risks. But ultimately, what we see is a destabilization of global user data as a result of this issue. So it's not just about trade between the US and China, though I've focused on the US and China here, but most countries are choosing between apps and platforms that are based in the US or Chinese digital ecosystem. And so they're all kind of facing this challenge of dealing with the lowest common denominator. Do you want US corporate tech exploitation, or do you want Chinese government exploitation of your user data? And so I was giving a talk, and I had a speaker from Indonesia, or a question asked by someone from Indonesia and someone from Egypt, and both of them were asking well, why does it matter? I mean, they're both both the US and China are trying to exploit us in different ways. So I think this indicates the need for greater leadership, particularly to demonstrate the utility of the U.S. system for allies and partners in the tech sector. This is particularly important in the context of something like China's digital Silk Road efforts to expand trade and investment in the tech sector globally. So in countries like Japan or Korea or in the European Union, we see the use of the precautionary principle, or in India actually is a really great example also, of developing anticipatory data oversight regulations and banning apps in advance of actual concerns occurring. But that's not necessarily how the US system works. There's a more risk-based approach where we allow apps and platforms to grow and flourish, and then are in a moment where we have influencers crying over the possibility of potential bans. And nobody wants to have a crying influencer that's impacting their potential voting block. So I mean, I wouldn't. And those crying influencers, those videos are they're very heartrending. I don't know if you guys have seen any of them, but I mean. All right. So in the book, I talk about a wide range of different case studies. So here I highlighted concerns. I highlighted the social media case and the gaming case, and to a lesser extent, agriculture. But in the book, I talk about everything from home devices, smart refrigerators, health data, so DNA testing, which is actually one of the areas where it's most concerning because of the potential generational impacts of data trafficking from a health data standpoint, as well as financial data, which actually TikTok is becoming involved in right now, kind of through the U.S. financial system. So I would love to, and I'm really eager to take your questions, and I always learn a lot from what people have to ask. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing more.
Questions?
Oh, yeah. And if you could say your name and what brings you here today. Yeah.
There's two federal courts that have made two different decisions over, I guess, Section 230.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court's gonna, I guess, make a decision in the next year or so.
Yeah.
If they decide to overrule Section 230 or make any kind of changes to that, does that change the whole digital situation in the U.S. for producers and everybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. So just as a little overview, so Section 230 prevents apps and platforms from having liability for the content that they produce or distribute, and treats them as distributors, not as curators and not as news generators, which has provided a lot of protection and a lot of support for the growth of the tech sector, particularly in the context of social media. So there's a lot of advocacy for the continuation of Section 230, and I don't think it's immediately clear that if the courts strike it down, there wouldn't be some kind of version of a replacement, because it's essentially the linchpin of a lot of the U.S. digital economy. But it'll be really interesting to see what happens and what type of liability we may see that emerges, not just for companies like TikTok or WeChat, but also companies like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And this is a fundamentally transformative issue. And the other significant question here is the courts are not necessarily the best place to be doing tech oversight. They may not be at the very heartbeat of a lot of these issues in terms of the expertise that they have. So that's another kind of frailty of the U.S. system. But I wanted to your follow-up.
Well, will it lead to a more European type style of regulation for the tech sectors?
I would say probably not. That would be my guess. But I think if Section 230 is struck down, there will be mass chaos. And I would be very, very shocked if those were anything but the narrowest possible decisions, because I think there is widespread understanding of the importance and foundational nature of Section 230. I would also hope that if that did happen, Congress would, one would dream that Congress would act promptly to find a way to address this. But if you just strike down Section 230 and there are no replacements for it, it's very difficult to envision what that digital landscape would look like. Let's hope that that's not what happens, because I think it would throw a lot of our world into chaos on a lot of levels. But thank you for your great question. Yes, sir.
I'm Bruno.
Hi, Bruno. Thank you.
Just like we're reaching agreements we're getting there in climate change and protecting the environment. How likely do you see an agreement on ethical AI, considering the power, the benefits, but also the power of destruction that AI can bring to democratic systems, and just fostering rogue states to pursue enemies in a more articulated way? So how likely do you see that there's going to be, at least from democratic systems, an alignment on what let's say ethic AI should be?
Yeah, I mean, so there's what I hope and dream, which is that there will be convergence in this area. I think that if there is leadership in this area, it would probably be more likely to not come from the U.S., to maybe come from the European Union or Japan or Australia, just because of the profit motives here that we see in a U.S. context. Actually, China has also tried to take leadership in this area, because the Chinese government has been very involved in establishing standards for trying to establish new standards for different AI tools. And one of the really interesting issues here is, for a lot of AI technologies, in order to establish new standards and practices, you actually have to share your technology to identify what that standard will be. And the Chinese government is able to pressure Chinese companies to do that. The US government does not have that same kind of power to pressure US companies to share proprietary AI information or AI products in order to be able to drive new standards making. So when we're looking at who is able to take leadership in ethical AI and what ethical AI constitutes, that is a really interesting, significant challenge that the U.S. would face in terms of moving leadership forward. So that's a great question. Thank you so much. Yes.
Miss, long range. What is the bottom line to you? What worries you the most about this, the potential?
Yeah, so I would say that for me, in terms of long-range concerns, the lack of protection of health data is definitely the kind of biggest question mark that I have. So we're right across from the medical center, and actually I met my husband here in Texas, and he did his training in the Texas Medical Center, so we talk about this all the time. But there's a belief that HIPAA, for example, protects user data, protects patient data very broadly. But actually it only protects your data, it only protects your patient data when you're in your interactions with your doctor. So for example, if you are going to like a mass, like your CVS vaccination data, not protected. Your Apple Watch data is not protected. If there's like a mass insurance acquisition of user data, that's also not protected. And more we have health data that's being or your Ancestry.com, like 23andMe, where you're sharing your DNA with a company and they're telling you who your cousins are. That is not protected under HIPAA either. That data can be purchased and sold by data brokers. And
Do we care?
well, I mean, we might care if it's the linchpin of something like key precision medicine techniques that would be the determinant of longevity or important medical therapies. We might also care if it's related to the development of targeted bioweapons. Sorry, I wrote my first book on Hollywood, and and my friends and family are just like, this is really so much more depressing than your first book. But yes. Oh, actually, since we already had the chance to chat, can I? Okay, in the back. Yes.
Can it be argued that federalized data privacy regulation in the United States would actually benefit big tech in light of the fact that there are something like 11 different states now that have their own organized data privacy rules, and it's very difficult to come in compliance with all of the different types of rules that come out?
Yeah, I think that you could definitely make that argument, and actually we're even seeing movement in that direction. So, for example, this summer there was a three corners agreement, which means two House committees and one Senate committee, or two House chairmen and one Senate, or two House leaders and one Senate leader were willing to move forward the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, and it didn't move forward. Largely because there was concern on the Democratic Senate side that the penalties were not severe enough in the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. And then at the same time, we also saw the Dobbs decision where user data became embroiled in another kind of complex US political concern. So we have this, so there definitely is a movement toward greater consensus. The challenge is it's a lot easier to find consensus on much more narrowly defined issues, like, for example, banning TikTok on government devices, than developing a comprehensive data privacy oversight framework. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that there isn't a lot of excitement about moving between Utah and California and Virginia and trying to figure out, how your data is going to be, how you're going to develop an economy of scale for your product with those regulations. So hopefully we're moving in that direction. The big challenge is, even with the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, it was a 4-year-long window to become adjusted to it, and even then, the only enforcement mechanism was via lawsuit. So, in order to actually bring action, you have to have so much financial capacity, or be able to come up with a class action lawsuit, which companies like TikTok and Facebook and YouTube all ban as part of their terms of service. So that's also so it would have to be driven by someone other than users in a lot of cases. So let's see. I see in the back. Yes.
Well, yes. Partway through, you mentioned on one slide the context that there are data we provide voluntarily, and the implication involuntarily and unknowingly as well. And you use the term of the commons, putting it in the context of the commons, which we hear a lot for climate issues, which we may not have control over. The implication, I believe, was that we have some control, although I'm beginning to wonder if we have any control between the mergers and the daisy chaining and the marketing. Is there a direction in a good way you think that's going?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is to develop an awareness of thinking about this issue as an issue of collective action rather than as individual decision making. And I think this is crucial because the tech sector has worked very hard to make these issues of individual responsibility. And this is where it comes down to this idea that we all should be in charge of monitoring our privacy settings, reading the terms of service, and if we just do that, we will be protected from data exploitation. And it's like, I mean, in the data ethics of TikTok class, one of the clauses on the TikTok terms of service is, if we change anything about these terms of service at any time, by signing the terms of service, you have agreed to those changes in the future. So it's a bit of an absurdity, just, much like it is to say, don't use these plastic straws and then we'll solve climate change. It's a bit unfair, it's a bit misleading, and I think it's important to change how we talk about these questions. Similar to the TikTok ban question, I mean, just addressing the ban of one individual app without looking at the larger system of data broker acquisitions of user data, without looking at data acquisition by other types of institutional actors, becomes is very misleading, because it suggests that we're solving a problem that's much larger than what's actually being addressed.
But there's hope.
I'm an optimist, and I wouldn't have spent the entirety of the pandemic getting up in the morning and writing this book if I didn't think that it was worth educating people about these issues. So I put my money where my mouth is. So I think I think there is a way that we can change the debate, and that's my hope here. And see, in the front, sir, yes.
There's no saying, he who plays the fiddler calls the tune. In this particular case, we're dealing with a consumer nation.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of Americans' economy, so much of our economy is dependent upon Chinese cooperation that we're not able to get leverage on them. And their jurisdictional issues, their technological issues, so that they have the ability to get inside our bank accounts, our debits, and we don't know what the limits are because it's all electronic and technological. So my question is, how can we get a handle on controlling Chinese exploitation of our economy for their own political benefit? How can we get control of that to the extent that we don't injure Americans' pocketbook?
Well, this is the core issue, right? That's a great. And so this becomes a really significant challenge because one of the issues that we see here is the reason that there hasn't been more digital oversight is because it financially benefits the U.S. tech sector. So in some ways, there is this balance that we need to address between protecting user data in a U.S. context and limiting financial benefits that those corporations are able to derive, while also using that as a tool to protect U.S. users, from China, or from Chinese data acquisitions. Now, but even the same people have concerns about this. So as part of my research, I was doing field work and talking with people in LA who worked at some of the digital platforms, and I was talking about my book, and I was like, what do you think about this? And they were like, well, the only way that we can continue to operate is if we continue to be able to gather user data as much as we need to, because otherwise it'll be too damaging to our business. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And then the next question was, so do you think it's safe for my kid to use TikTok? And I was like, man, you know about the data that's being gathered better than I do. And I'm just explaining to you how it might be exported.
There's going to be some domestic penalties.
Right, exactly.
If we get a handle on this problem.
Yeah.
We have to restrict. I mean, the whole theory, going back to when we recognized China, is that we're going to change them. They're going to become more democratic. But we forgot that government is not just another interest group.
Right.
It has military power.
Yeah.
It has the ability to make people in foreign countries disappear. And with that kind of power, particularly when they're working with other nations that we have to deal with in terms of our own security, we are basically leveraging our future for the interest of people who are making money off China. So my question is it not possible for Congress to impose boundaries on the Chinese exploitation of the American economy being used for the purpose of undermining American security?
Well, I think this is a great question, and the issue is this kind of targeted. The issue is the targeting of those regulations, and the fact that many of the stakeholders in a lot of these concerns are also donors to Congress. So it's a tough one. I see some hands in the back.
We have time for maybe one, maybe two more.
Okay, maybe we do a lightning round. Let's see, in the back in the purple shirt, and then with the blue blazer.
Hi, I have a question. Because the bulk of your talk was about TikTok, right? And how China is using TikTok's data. My question is, did the entrance of TikTok accelerate this conversation of data trafficking, or has it already started a long time ago?
Great question. And then your question, and I can answer them both at the same time. And then I'll just take this gentleman's question over here as well, since I'm looking in this way. If you want to ask your question, and then you can ask as well.
So you mentioned oil is the new data. Wait, data is the new oil.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know much about data, but I'm from the oil industry.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to see how China and the U.S. are approaching data as the same as they did oil. We have a lot of private U.S.
Yeah.
We have a lot of Chinese state-owned oil, right? So that's seeing those two trends.
Yeah.
We've seen also, as individuals, we can't really protect ourselves against oil.
Mm.
Is there going to be a change, right? We have to use oil to transport in
Right,
the city.
yeah.
A lot of us will have friends who have mineral rights their grandpa
Yeah.
bought. And guess what? We bought this lot and we don't have the mineral rights. Like, is there something we need to be doing as individuals, perhaps to follow up to this gentleman's question, to protect ourselves with this new oil?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this final question?
If the Chinese know my social security number and other things, and we know data on their citizens, what bad things can happen because they what could they do?
What are the risks? Okay, great. So with respect to, those are all great questions, and I'll try to pull them together. So with respect to TikTok, all of these issues predated TikTok. The main reason why I use this and why I use that case in today's talk is just because this is an example that is resonant with people. And if I talk about precision agriculture, then we first have to talk about what precision agriculture is and what its larger implications are. And so it's a little bit difficult, more difficult to grasp. So in the book, I talk about social media first and then go into the other cases. So it's just kind of a way for us to first grab onto this issue. But I appreciate your question. With respect to these potential risks, and I think this can fit within this question of rights and protecting user rights. There are a couple of different layers of risk. So first, there's the risk of individual surveillance, and U.S.-based social media platforms can't operate in a Chinese context. So when you're looking at surveillance of populations, it's not actually symmetrical. So that's one point. But actually, individual risk is less of a concern. We can also talk about population level risk, the ability to model different populations, their interests, how they behave, being able to push forward certain types of messaging while suppressing other types of messaging through platforms that might serve as critical communications infrastructure. In the case of agriculture, we also see dependence on key critical infrastructure that can then be pulled back if there's a conflict between China and the United States. There's also this issue of economic competitiveness. So when U.S. platforms can't operate in a Chinese context, they're not as economically competitive. By contrast, Chinese platforms can actually operate globally in both countries. And then that's in terms of economic security or economic competitiveness. But a lot of these technologies also have dual use implications. So for example, when we talk about the Tencent case, with the development of new AI tools for military use, an expansive gaming AI insights that Tencent can develop as part of its global operations also help to inform the development of AI for military applications. Now, when we're talking about something like protecting individual rights and thinking about how we deal with this question of the collectivity versus individual protection, this is actually a really interesting area of thinking through what actually constitutes the rights of the individual. What are our rights to our user data? And how do we control this? What does it mean from a generational standpoint? So at this point, we have very little control or power over our user data. And our through terms of service are basically signing over our lives and our intellectual property to the platforms that we're using. So one thing that I would urge people to do would be to try to advocate in your communities, in your state, in Congress, for more collective action decision making, rather than just having to kind of address these issues individually, when it's really not, even though that tends to be the way that we think about a lot of policy issues here in the US, that's not a way that we can actually address a lot of these collective action issues related to larger scale economic and political security. So thank you so much for all of your great questions.
So please feel free to follow us out into the main room where Dr. Kokas will be signing copies of her book provided by Broad.